I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my work about how and when and where polar bears might be able to adapt to climate change. I am an NSERC postdoctoral research fellow. I work collaboratively with Polar Bears International, the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance, and Environment and Climate Change Canada. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of my research on adaptation in polar bears from a genetics perspective. So that's quite a bit of a mouthful. So I'd like to start by just going through some of the basics of polar bear biology. So polar bears are found across the Arctic. There's approximately 20 to 25,000 polar bears worldwide. They're broken into 19 populations. You can see them outlined here. And Canada actually has 2/3 of all polar bears in the world. And so what that means is that our country has a significant role to play in the conservation and management of polar bears. Sea ice, as you are probably aware, is very important to polar bears. Mating occurs on the ice, and once mating has happened, polar bear females will find a den. They'll spend 2 to 3 months in there, and then they'll care for their cubs for about 3 years. And this requires that they hunt all of the food for their cubs and teach them all about hunting seals. Because seals are the primary prey source of polar bears. They mostly rely on ringed and bearded seals. And how they access their food is they will find a lair under the ice. They'll punch through the ice, take a seal pup, and eat most of the blubber off the seals. This is probably 95% of their diet. They will also eat harbor seals, walrus, and sometimes they'll take a beluga, but for the most part, all of their feeding occurs on the ice. When polar bears are not on the ice, when the sea ice melts in the summer, they typically don't eat. They will and have been known to scavenge. A couple of them have been documented to take caribou, and sometimes they'll get into a town dump. The town of Churchill, Manitoba, which is where I do my research, has a polar bear jail for polar bears that get into the dump one too many times. But for the most part, if polar bears are on land, they're fasting. And when they're fasting, they will lose up to 1 kilogram of body weight per day until they make it back on the ice. So polar bears, as you can imagine, are extremely well adapted to life on the sea ice. Adaptations are evolved changes in physical or genetic traits that lead to an increase in either survival or reproduction. So polar bears that are adapted to sea ice are ones that survive better or produce more cubs. You can think of adaptations like the big teeth that polar bears have to eat through thick seal hide, their big fuzzy paws that help them walk on sea ice, and of course their iconic white or translucent fur that helps them blend into that sea ice landscape. So hopefully by now I've convinced you that sea ice is essential for polar bears. And that brings us to our problem. Climate change is leading to warming across the world, but it's happening at a pace that is much faster in the Arctic. Here, I'm showing you the North Pole in 1979, and I'm just going to outline the extent of the sea ice in red here. I'm going to show you the same spot in 2022 and keep that outline. And so what you can see is that we've lost almost 1/3 of the sea ice in the Arctic, and this poses a significant challenge for polar bears. We know that sea ice loss is harmful for bears. When they're not on the sea ice, they can't hunt their primary prey source. They have to go through longer fasting periods, and this is really tough for cubs that are smaller and have less mass to lose. They're also more likely to be exposed to disease and pollution as warming is increasing the amount of pathogens that are coming out of the ice and the permafrost. And they're getting into conflict with humans, which you can probably imagine from the polar bear jail that almost always has 1 or 2 occupants. So all of this leads to negative effects for polar bears. So I was interested in understanding if polar bears could adapt to sea ice loss. Now, my PhD was answering questions like this, but I was working with plants. And for plants, you take a bunch of them, you grow them in a greenhouse, and you see which survives better, which has more offspring. You can't do that with polar bears. They won't cooperate with that. So instead, we took a genetic perspective. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about some genetic terms, specifically alleles. Alleles are a variable sequence of DNA at a particular location in the genome. You can think of this as a unit of variation. And so bears that have more alleles are ones that have more genetic diversity. Bears with fewer alleles have lower genetic diversity. And this is important because we can use genetic diversity to assess bears' capacity for adaptation. And how we do that looks a little bit like this. Let's say we have some sea ice loss and we've got 3 different types of bears. The blue genetic background bear produces 4 cubs, the yellow genetic background bear produces 3 cubs, and the red only produces 1. We can scan the Arctic and look for different DNA sequences that might correspond to bears that have more or fewer cubs to assess whether or not they're likely to be adapting to climate change. And this operates on the premise that genetic diversity is essential for adaptation. Let's say we have sea ice loss here on the x-axis and some kind of physical or genetic trait on the y-axis, and adaptation would be something that shifts polar bears from green to orange. And this allows them to survive better, cope with sea ice loss. The rate and likelihood of that adaptation taking place relies on how much genetic variation is in that polar bear population. Genetic variation provides the raw material for adaptations to take place. So if you have more genetic diversity, you're just more likely to be able to adapt. Whereas if you have less genetic diversity, you're more likely to be maladapted or unable to adapt. And so what we did was we scanned 13 of the populations in Canada and we looked at how much genetic diversity was in those populations. And what we found looks a little bit like this. So I have population here shown by these codes, which correspond to these 13 populations here. On the y-axis, I have genetic diversity, and what I want you to notice is that it's these 6 populations here that correspond to the northern Arctic, the high Arctic, that have the lowest genetic diversity. And so this suggests that these populations are the ones that are least likely to adapt. We decided to take this one step further, and we scanned for hotspots of maladaptation across the Arctic. What you do to do these scans, you take some alleles, and you map them across an environmental gradient. Here we're looking at sea ice thickness or sea ice loss. You then take climate models that predict future changes in sea ice condition under different warming scenarios. So here we looked at the climate scenario for 2100. And you can use machine learning to combine these to predict how much polar bear populations are likely to shift in their allele frequencies under this new environment. And here, what we're assuming is that populations that have to make a bigger shift are ones that are more likely to be maladapted because they have to go farther in order to adapt. We found that, consistent with our results on genetic diversity, it was the northern polar bears that were most at risk of maladaptation. So here I'm showing you a map of our study area, and these circles here show the polar bears. Bears that have a higher risk of maladaptation are the ones shown with the warmer colors, and you can see they're almost all clustered in the north of the Arctic. But what I do want to point out is that all bears had to go through some degree of shift in order to cope with climate change. And so what this suggests is that while bears in the north are most likely to be maladapted, all polar bears in the Canadian Arctic are going to face challenges in coping with sea ice loss. So some of you might be asking, well, what about hybridization with grizzly bears? Grizzly bears can cope with warmer climates. They're very closely related to polar bears. Can they hybridize to make roller bears? And this is a picture of a roller bear from one of the zoos. You can see they're really cute, they're fuzzy, they're brown, little brown. And so we were interested in looking at how often hybridization might occur. In the wild, in Canada, we have 10 known instances of polar bears, of roller bears, sorry. They're very easy to identify because they have a big stripe down their back. But we wanted to know, are there any hidden hybrids? So we scanned about 900 bears across the Arctic, and it turns out we're actually really good at finding hybrids. We didn't find any other cases of hybridization. And so what this suggests is that hybridization is not a viable avenue for adaptation for polar bears. So to circle back to my original question, can polar bears adapt to sea ice loss? doesn't look like they have a good chance of being able to do so. There might be some regions of the Arctic that might be better suited to warming climates, but overall, we're going to see significant challenges for polar bears in the coming years. And so what we should be doing is focusing on preserving the remaining sea ice habitat and trying to reduce emissions as much as possible to lower how much warming the environment is going to experience in the next 75 years. So with that, I'd like to say thank you. I have my funding sources and some collaborators up here. Happy to take questions, I guess, at the end of the talks.